Thank you. So all in favor of the adopting the agenda as amended? The agenda is adopted. Next, we have, if you have a conflict of interest or a pecuniary interest to declare, you can do it now, or you can do it whenever we get to the item that's the issue. Now we have the approval of the minutes from our October 19th, 2022 board meeting. Could I have a mover to approve those minutes, please? Moved by Bev Holmes, seconded by John Inglis. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of approving the minutes? Minutes are approved. Item number 3, we have a staff report or water conditions report from from Jennifer North. And are you going to come to the front to do it, Jen?
Yeah, so that the people online can see her. Perfect. There you go. You can minimize the other. There you go. Okay. Yep.
Is this mic on? Yes. Yes. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer North. I'm the Water Resources Technologist here at Mississippi Valley. I'm going to give you a short but sweet report on just current conditions in the watershed and kind of what we're seeing and what we're doing to prep for spring freshet. So for the month of November, flows in most tributaries we're sitting slightly below normal. This is due to the slightly below average rain amounts for October and November. Current flows are slowly starting to pick up due to the recent rainfall events and increased flows in the upper lakes. So flows are now sitting at closer to normal for this time of year. Drawdowns on all the upper lakes are completed, except for we need to pull 2 more logs out of Mazenau Lake. So we'll do that at the end of the week. Water levels on most of the upper lakes are close to reaching their winter targets, which is good for a freeze up. We'd like to hit those targets before the lake freezes up. Those lakes will be operated through the remainder of the winter just to keep those stable levels and make sure nothing, not too much fluctuation happens when the ice is on the lakes. Levels on Cachewackamack and Mazenau will continue to drop through through late December and mid-January before they reach their normal winter holdings. This is normal due for the later drawdown on Mazenau Lake. Crotch Lake is currently building through the release of the water from the upper lake drawdowns. The dam will be operated through the next month to ensure that there's enough water in the system to maintain flows downstream of Crotch Lake. So we'll maintain flows and we'll start in January, we'll start to draw down that lake and provide maximum storage in the system come spring, which we aim to be around early to mid-March. We would like to have the whole system empty and ready for the spring freshet. So all the lakes will be operated through the winter to try and maintain these levels and make sure we have lots and lots of storage. The long range forecast, I don't have any visuals for you because the previous presentation we got on the forecasting was a Zoom meetings. So I don't have the PDFs for those drawings, but January is December is supposed to be slightly colder weather with normal seasonal precip. January and into February is supposed to be colder than normal. We're looking at a cold winter and with normal precip amounts though. With Southern Ontario, they're predicting more precip down there because of the lakefront effect, but we don't see a lot of that hit our area. Sometimes it will hit kind of the upper portion of our watershed, but it will kind of depends on the patterns in the weather. So we'll wait and see what we get. Again, this does not project what we'll see in the spring. So that will depend on how much precip, how much snow, how much rain we receive in the next 4 months, how quickly temperatures increase when they melt the snow. That will indicate how severe the flooding will be, and how much rainfall we get at the same time as that melt. Any questions?
John Ingles, go ahead, and I'll just have you lower the screen so I can
Yep.
see the folks on the Zoom side of the meeting.
Jen, do you ever get any input requests from Hydro regarding the electrical generation units at High Falls, at Carlton Place? No, you don't generate at Carlton
No,
Place.
no.
At, what's the next one? Appleton, and
So, sorry, what was the first?
do you get any requests for flow? Do you get direction from Hydro as to what flow they might like?
It's kind of the majority of actually all of the generating stations are run of the river. So they basically get what they get. We don't manage the system solely for hydro. We operate it in a way that benefits all the users on the system. So if we have the water and it's available, then yes, we will push it through. But if it's basically all systematic. We don't have a lot of wiggle room to use for hydro. It's there if it's there.
So they're kind of second priority.
Yeah, they're not the main priority, but we do like the drawdowns and stuff, and making sure that we have a sustainable flow downstream that helps with the hydro. So drawing down or filling up crotch right now so that they have flow between January and March. That helps. We draw down crotch in the summertime. That gives them flow throughout the summer when normally, lakes will all be full and left alone. Crotch Lake is drawn down. So Crotch Lake is our main reservoir, and it's used more with hydro production because all of our hydro stations are the lower end. So just keeping that flow in the lower part of the watershed helps with that.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Jen? Thanks a lot, Jen.
No problem.
Next item, we have a staff report on stewardship initiatives from Marissa Oakham. Hi, Marissa.
Hey, how are you? Next. Yes, yeah. All right, awesome. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Marissa Oakham. I work in the stewardship department here at MVCA. A lot of faces that I don't know, so lovely to meet all of you. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the stewardship initiatives that we've done this year and focus on 2 of the projects that we've been able to complete. There we go. So just as a quick overview, there's kind of 6 main functions of stewardship. So one of our main programs is the Shoreline Naturalization Program. Through this program, we do riparian plantings for private property owners. We also partner with 2 to 3 lakes a year to do a lake tree giveaway day. We have the Ottawa Rural Clean Water Program. So we deliver this on behalf of the city of Ottawa, just in our watershed within the rural city water limits. So it will support any project that will protect or enhance water quality and provide funding for those. New this year, we have Alice Lanark. So this is in partnership with Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. We've been able to bring Alice to Lanark. So Alice, for those of you who don't know, is a program that helps provide technical and financial support for farmers who are looking to do any kind of ecosystem services on their marginalized land. It's been really exciting to launch that this year. We've got 3 really good projects going on. Unfortunately, those 3 projects are all in Rideau Valley's watershed. However, we've got a couple of really promising projects coming down the pipe for us next year. We also partner with Rideau Valley for them to do the tree planting. So they do any large scale tree plantings for us of a minimum of 1,000 trees. We just got the report back from them this year, and this year they planted 104,000 trees for us in our watershed, which is very impressive. And then 2 other things we do is just education and outreach and various habitat enhancements. So these can just be one-off programs. So I'm going to chat quickly about 2 of those. So one really exciting one that we did this year, quite possibly my favorite project I've ever gotten to work on, is the Turtle Nest Project. So at Morris Island Conservation Area, it was discovered that there was a lot of predated turtle nests, probably likely from raccoons. I think they found about 21 predated nests last year. So Canadian Wildlife Federation came to us to see if we could partner with them to build a new area for these turtles. Since OPG owns a lot of this land, they provided a lot of support and help for this project as well. You can see kind of down here, this is the island that we chose to build on. So this mound was not there before. Our lovely ops team built this little temporary walkway for us, which made life a lot easier. We had to carry about half a ton of substrate across to the island. Would have been a lot more difficult to do so in waders without wheelbarrows. So very thankful for our ops team for that. Next year, OPG will be installing some cameras to monitor and see if we've had any success with this project. We've been told to be realistic with our expectations. It can take a couple of years for the turtles to discover this new lovely area that we've built for them. But hopefully we'll start to see that being used next year, the next 2 years. Just a quick note. So we've seen northern map, western painted and snapping turtles in this area, 2 of which are considered species at risk. No Blandings turtles yet, but maybe one day we'll see one. And then just quickly to touch on another major project we did. This one we've actually kind of done over the past 8 years along Pool Creek. We've done several projects between 2014, 2019, and 2022 in partnership with the city. So we've done a couple fish habitat enhancements. So you can see down here, this is actually a lunker being installed. And this is a half, there we go. This is a half logger. These both provide refuge for fish, especially during spawning season. We also added riffles to this area. We've done several riparian plantings, which you can see over here. I think we planted over 100 trees and shrubs in 5 or 6 different locations. And then you'll see up here, that's me right there. We added some other erosion control methods to areas that weren't so appropriate for planting. So we added, I think, about 7 tons of rock to 6 different locations to help with the erosion control. You can see here we've done multiple invasive species removal events and some litter cleanup as well. We've also provided, I don't know if you guys know Councillor Glenn, but that's him there. A lovely profile is Matt. We have provided a lot of support for the city of Ottawa and some of their initiatives as well. There's a new bridge that they've just put in there, and we've helped them with the permitting and the environmental controls of that. They've also removed, I think, 8 blockages in the past 8 years in this creek. So we've done a lot of projects over the last few years. And it's been a really interesting opportunity because of the location of this work. You're running into a lot of people while you're working. And so that outreach and education has been a really neat part of that. And then I know you guys have a lot of exciting budget stuff to get to, so I won't take up too much more time, but just quickly coming down the pipe for us in 2023. Like I said, we've got a lot of Alice Lanark projects coming our way in our watershed. We're going to try to reinstate the City Stream Watch, which unfortunately had to be paused from COVID. A couple educational workshops, larger scale plantings, and invasive species removal projects, particularly in our lakes. Eurasian milfoil has become a really big issue, so it's something we're hoping to try and tackle next year. And then we've also partnered with Rideau Valley to give away butternut trees. So if anybody's interested, we have up to 10 free butternut trees per landowner. So you can my information's here. If anyone's interested in that or has any other questions or comments, please feel free to contact me.
Thanks, Marissa. Does anyone have any questions? Phil, go ahead.
The work that you did on Pool Creek, is that paid for by Ottawa or is that part of the general levy?
Matt, do you want to take this one?
Hi, Phil. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, I hear. Fine.
Yeah, sorry, my videos. Excuse me. That the majority of that funding, with some staff time contribution, is a result of some of the development that occurred in the Upper Pool Creek watershed, especially around the Fernbank wetlands. There were targets for infiltration that the development couldn't meet. So according to the Upper Pool Creek watershed study, there's essentially a penalty for those developments that can't meet the infiltration targets, and the city asked us to facilitate the compensation work along the creek as a result of that development.
Thanks. Could I just say, I'm hearing in Stittsville a lot of good words about the work that you try to do, like planting trees and so on. Much appreciated, and thanks for working the time in to do that. I know you got a busy schedule. Much appreciated.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yes, they are. They're seedlings. So they're quite small, but they are canker resistant.
Any other questions, comments for Marissa? Thanks, Marissa.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
We front-ended all the good news on the agenda for this meeting before we get to our other discussions. It's relative. It's relative. This is revenue. Next, we have a report on NDMP Risk Assessment Project report. We have three that Euro is going to be taking us through. Euro, the floor is yours for item number 4 on the agenda. Sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, but you cannot see me, and my apologies. I don't have my camera here with me today, but let me share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen?
We can see it.
All right, fantastic. So good morning, everyone. For the new members, my name is Euro Kanderlig, and I am a Director of Engineering at MVCA. And today I will be walking you through the findings of an interesting project that we recently completed at MVCA. Okay, so let's start with a quick recap. So this was back in 2020 when MVCA, South Nation, and RBCA submitted a joint application to Public Safety Canada under the National Disaster and Mitigation Program to conduct a desktop flood risk assessment study for our 3 watersheds. The project had a total budget of roughly $338,000. The NDMP projects are cost shared, so the federal government provided 50% of this amount. And MVCA contribution was roughly $558,000. We received approval for this project in May 2021 when the project was initiated, and the project was then completed earlier this year in August 2022. The project had 3 main objectives. The first was to basically develop criteria and methodology that could be used to complete this flood risk assessment and evaluate floodplain mapping projects, then undertake the risk assessment to identify high flood risk areas, and finally develop a floodplain mapping strategy. So this slide shows the methodology that we used for this project. The first 2 tasks was basically just a very massive data collection process. I will be talking about it later on. So basically collecting the data and developing a GIS database. Then another important task was reach delineation for our 3 watersheds. Then, as I said, definition of the criteria, adjustment factors, and completing risk assessment, and then basically development of floodplain mapping strategy. Most of these tasks were completed in-house, with the exception of the last one. The floodplain mapping strategy was completed by a consultant that was retained to work on this project. So the reach delineation was a really important step in this project. The reach was really like defined as this kind of thing. You can think about it as the smallest computational unit to which we attributed all the data that we collected. We used reaches to perform all mathematical calculations, and also we use reaches to post-process and evaluate the results. You can see the flow chart here is basically the model that we developed in ArcGIS for the evaluation. I don't want to go into too much detail. Just want to say that we follow, federal and provincial guidelines, for defining the flood hazard limit. It's defined as 125 hectares. So basically, each reach that we delineated had to drain at a minimum of 125 hectares. That's how it was achieved. And all these reaches were delineated for water courses, like river streams in our watershed, for water bodies in our lakes, and also for the Ottawa River shoreline. And you can see the numbers here on this slide. So when we sum it up, we basically delineated over 1,500 reaches in our watershed. So it was a large number. And you can see the reach delineation for water courses here, with some simplification, but there's over 1,000 of them shown here. The next slide shows the reach delineation for water bodies, basically our bigger lakes in our watershed. So we had, I believe, like over 130. And then this last slide here shows the, I don't know if you can see my mouse, it's basically the Ottawa River shoreline, right? So that was, again, like split up into a bunch of reaches. So once that step was accomplished, the next important step here was the flood risk assessment. And, as you might know, flood risk is typically determined by a combination of flood hazard, which is basically the likelihood of flood exposure, and flood vulnerability, which then relates to the consequence of flooding. So up here you can see a typical, 5x5 risk matrix, right? So you can basically likelihood or the flood hazard is shown on left. 1 means a low hazard, 5 means a high or high likelihood of flooding, and then up here we have the consequence. So 1 means low, 5 means catastrophic, right? So. And then we have here in color the calculated risk level, right? So basically low 1 all the way up to 25. So that's basically the principle of completing flood risk assessment by looking at those two criteria. Now, in terms of the flood hazard, we used 4 numerical criteria to estimate the flood hazard in a watershed, and you can see those criteria listed here. So the first one was curve number. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept, it's the U.S. Soil Conservation Service basically methodology. Curve number is an empirical number that relates to soil infiltration capabilities and land cover. High curve number means low infiltration and high runoff, and vice versa. Low curve number means high infiltration potential and low runoff. And the second one was the distance to the watercourse or reach. Again, closer we are, the higher is the hazard. Obviously, the same goes for the height, right? The elevation in relation to the water course, and the last one was slope. Again, the higher the slope, the more energy the flow has, and the hazard is higher. In terms of flood vulnerability, we use 5 criteria, which are listed here. First one was people and social impacts, then environmental impacts, economical impacts, infrastructure impacts, and public sensitivity impacts. And finally, we also applied adjustment factors in this study, and we applied 3. The first one was basically existing floodplain mapping. We thought that if a reach, a stream or lake was already mapped, we have some information about the risk. So the overall flood risk that was calculated was reduced if we had existing floodplain mapping for that reach or for that lake. And the second one was flood-prone area. We know what are the flood-prone areas in our watershed. So the risk was adjusted and was increased for those reaches that were located within the flood-prone areas, known flood-prone areas. And the last one was urban development. Again, this is mostly applicable to Carp River watershed, and the development is part of the Ottawa jurisdiction. There's lots of new development happening, and we felt that the flood risk should be increased for those reaches. So now this next slide basically shows some of these criteria. I'm only showing a very small fraction here. So the first on the left is a table that lists, the one of the vulnerability criteria, namely people and social impacts. And as you can see, each of these criteria was further subdivided into more subcategories, right? So the people and social impacts were subdivided into fatalities, population, number of displaced individuals, duration of displacements, and so forth. Similarly, we had the criterion for infrastructure, and that was subdivided into transportation, basically vicinity of highways, roads, railroads, energy and utilities, basically pipelines, hydro corridors, then vulnerable buildings. We looked at those as well, hospitals, schools, long-term care, things like that. Also, drinking water, wellhead protection zones, IPZs, intake protection zones. And so this is just, give you the appreciation how much data was collected as part of this exercise, right? So as I said, this is only a very small fraction, and then all this data was collected for every single reach, right? And we had over 1,500 reaches delineated. So once this step was then accomplished, the risk was calculated basically by multiplying the hazard by vulnerability, which gave us the unadjusted flood risk. And then we also multiplied by the adjustment factors to get the adjusted risk at the end of the day. Okay, so now here you can see the map, basically the flood hazard in a watershed. The color coding is green is basically low hazard, red is a high hazard, right? So we see the score goes from 0 to 5, red being 5, and green goes closer to 0. Right, so that's the first outcome. Then the flood vulnerability is the next. Again, the same color coding: red high vulnerability, green low, and you can kind of see that this outcome, kind of makes sense. We see a lot of green lines corresponding to our head watershed, where there is mostly, urban, rural, forested areas. Whereas we have a bunch of red lines, in our lower areas where we have our urban centers and whatnot. But I guess one eye opener here was to see that many of our lakes are red, have high vulnerability, and this is basically, when we think about flooding, then we typically have rivers in mind, but in a watershed, we have a unique watershed compared to other CAs, because we are blessed to have many lakes, right? And the lakes is where that attracts, residents, permanent, seasonal recreation, businesses, and all that, right? So it makes these areas, lakes, vulnerable, right? So I think this is kind of like that takeaway message is maybe more attention is needed to look at the vulnerability of lakes and the risk, flood risk in our lakes. And then, so we basically then took those two maps and multiplied them to obtain the flood risk, which you can see on this map here. And you need to kind of keep in mind that, we can have high vulnerability, but the flood hazard might be low, which will then result in average flood risk, and vice versa, right? The flood hazard might be high, but vulnerability might be low, right? So this is more complex, more complicated, I guess, map to look at, because it's really is summarizing both the hazards and the vulnerability. All right. So the last step of this project was to then complete the floodplain mapping strategy. You can see the workflow on here. The first step was to identify high-risk reaches. These reaches were then grouped into work packages. So how we did this, is just basically just using some logic and create some meaningful, basically projects, right? You can think of the work packages as projects, floodplain mapping projects. And then the next step was to apply unit costs to these packages or projects, and what we did for that. So the 3 CAs, we completed previous projects, so we knew what was the size of the project and what was the cost, the total cost. We were able to calculate basically the cost per kilometer of the reach that was mapped. The consultant also had his own database of projects completed in Eastern Ontario, and we plotted it and obtained this relationship, which kind of shows that the larger is the project, obviously the unit cost of mapping is lower, which makes sense. That's what we would expect to see. So, and then we use this relationship to basically assign approximate cost to these work packages, right? And then once we've done that, these packages, we prioritize them and we prepare the 10-year plan. Okay, so this map shows our work packages. We identified 28 basically work packages or floodplain mapping projects, if you will. You can see them here. Is this color coding really doesn't represent anything. It's just to differentiate these different projects. So 28 packages, and they should will address the high flood risk areas in our watershed. Now the next slide shows the breakdown of these work packages. The table on left is the work packages identified for our watercourses, and the table on the right shows the work packages for lakes. And this might be a little bit overwhelming at first, but I just want to say that this includes all projects, right? So there are some projects that have been recently completed. There are some projects that are underway. So just looking at the watercourses, for instance. So we see the Lower Mississippi River. We completed this project last year, right? And we have Carp River. This is ongoing project. We are hoping to have that finalized next year. Carp River tributaries, again, this is part of the next agreement with the city. So this actually is good to see that the projects we are already addressing or have addressed are right at the top of the table, right? So it gives us some additional confidence, I guess, to these results. And then, so what's really next? And in line here is, like we also need to look at the adjusted risk here. So, anything, these are like differences in first, second decimal points. So it's a tie, right? So really what we should be addressing next is the upper Mississippi, obviously starting from Mississippi Lake going upstream. Then it's the Clyde River and Fall River, right? So that would be the next in line here. And then when we look at the lakes, then Mississippi Lake, it has been on our radar already. So we've been looking at the Mississippi Lake and the needs to update the mapping. And we also have Charlotte Lake, there's lots of recreational activities happening on that lake, and Silver Lake as well, right? That's the top three. Now, this breakdown also shows the estimated cost in 2022 dollars. So just summing everything up, we would end up with approximately $3.7 million to accomplish these projects, or approximately $4 million to do the work. Now, this next slide shows the some of the planning aspects of the floodplain mapping strategy. And what the consultant did for us was basically he tried to project his work packages into 10-year long planning horizon, right? And so why 10-year? It's like we use 10-year horizons for capital planning, for other planning activities, and then 10 years is also kind of the time at which we want to evaluate existing floodplain mapping flood lines to see if a revision is warranted, or basically an update is needed or not, right? So that's basically that. This table obviously was the 10-year horizon was used for all three ECAs. The consultant did not take into consideration things like resources, right, and other things. So it's really, you can think of this just like to just a starting point, right, for planning future floodplain mapping work. And so when you see that if we take the 10-year planning horizon, we would be doing 3 to 4 floodplain mapping projects per year, and would need approximately $400,000 in our budget, right, to accomplish this work. So that's basically what is this showing. Yeah. And then I guess that brings me to conclusions. The first one is, this is really a desktop study, so we did not collect any field data as part of this exercise, right, which obviously could not be accomplished at a watershed scale. So what I just want to say that this give us some big picture, some starting point, and we need to take the results with a grain of salt. If we have a priority 5 versus priority 6, it's very close. It's so we need to kind of keep that in mind. This project generated some really useful outcomes that go beyond this study and this project. One of them is the watershed reach delineation. So we basically sliced and diced our watershed into these small homogeneous species, and I see many applications of this down the road in our future work, right? Like, for instance, for low flow studies or water quality studies, we can be looking at erosion studies and erosion mapping and all that, right? We could reuse this outcome. The other one is obviously the work packages. For the first time, we really try to combine, the reaches into some meaningful, logical projects, right, that can be then used to plan the future floodplain mapping work. So that's another really useful outcome, I guess, of the project. Now, just going back to the key takeaway messages here, I think the one of the more important ones is that, like when we look at the flood hazard, it largely remains unmapped in our watershed. We have many new projects that we identified in these work packages. So in other words, there is a long way to go. We'll have our hands, full, and we'll be busy, basically completing these flood mapping projects to address, to quantify the flood hazard in the watershed. The other one is the importance of lakes, obviously, that I mentioned previously. They may deserve more attention from the natural hazard perspective in the future, and also importance of our water management in flood mitigation, right? As you know, we completed restoration of Shabomika earlier this year, and we increased the available freeboard of the structure by more than 2 feet, which puts us in a better position to deal with some extreme flooding events, right? We will be just initiating the Kashwakamak dam replacement project, which will be designed for a higher IDF or inflow design flow, right? So again, this will give us some more room to tackle extreme weather events. There's also potential to maybe increase the storage available as we are basically replacing or repairing some of our structures, right? So then as going back to the 10-year plan, so again, like we need to think about it as really that big picture, the initial step that we will now build on and include our considerations for our resources and priorities. Basically, start to prioritize the priorities, I guess, in the next step. And also we need to look at some other aspects and activities that we do. We don't do floodplain mapping projects at MVCA in isolation, right? It ties into other activities and projects. One thing that needs to be considered here, obviously, is the logistics, how we do the floodplain mapping. For instance, we can't start mapping the upper Mississippi unless we have the Mississippi Lake, for instance, completed, right? Because obviously the elevation in the lake will dictate the flooding upstream, right? So that's one example. The other example is our capital infrastructure projects, right? All structures in our watershed require dam safety reviews, and as part of dam safety reviews, we need floodplain models, right, to do inundation studies and validate the inflow design flood for these structures. So again, we might have some priorities in our capital infrastructure plan, and it needs to line up with the other priorities for our floodplain mapping projects as well. The last example I wanted to mention here is the flood forecasting. Again, we have some ongoing modeling efforts. We are building a flood forecasting system for our watershed that would also prioritize obviously the main stem of the river, which is most important for the flood forecasting in our watershed. So I leave it there. This is my last slide, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Euro. I'll just have you lower your slides. And that was a thorough presentation, but I think it gives us an appreciation of the scope of work that goes into the work that really is the meat and potatoes of what conservation authorities are here to do. So does anyone have any questions? Janet, go ahead.
Yeah, just a clarification on what you said right near the end. And I think what you were saying is there are dependencies between mapping certain areas and having data from other areas. So that some things, even though they might be a higher priority, you might have to do something else first or get data from somewhere else, from say upper watershed first before you can do something farther down the watershed. Is that what you were saying? The dependencies there?
It's exactly correct. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you have to take all of that into consideration, even though these priorities are here.
Exactly.
We may have to adjust the plan.
It's not just about the priorities. So
Right.
there's other things attached that needs to go into, this planning. One of them is, yes, as you mentioned, is this logistics, that we can be just doing these projects. It's all interconnected. Right.
Yeah, that's actually where it comes down to is how interconnected all the elements of the watershed are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Richard, and then Phil.
Had high risk and another one that had vulnerability. And I'm sure you said, but I didn't catch, what's the difference?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
I thought there was two maps there, one showing high risk of flooding and one saying vulnerability.
Oh, yeah, so there was actually three maps. The one was showing, and I don't know, I can maybe go back and show it again. Just
No,
give
but I
me-
just wondered what the definition, the difference between the two is.
Yeah. So we have this first map, it shows the flood hazard. Okay, I don't know if you can now see my screen again.
We can see it.
Yeah,
Okay, so this is the flood hazard, which means, you know, what is the likelihood of flooding, right? It means the red, the likelihood that the flooding will occur is higher than, you know, in areas where we see the green or the yellow.
good.
And so that's flood hazard. The second one is the flood vulnerability, which means, you know, what is the consequence of flooding? So if the flooding do occur, what would be the damage? You know, what would be the consequence? Again, green being low, red being high. And then the final map is the combination where we multiply hazard with vulnerability, we will get the overall flood risk. So
Okay.
basically that's combining the flood hazard with flood vulnerability.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No,
If I could just add to that, if we think of the first as being the physiology, the geography, and the second one being the people, social factors, and you combine the two to get the combined risk.
Yes, in the introduction to the slide, you mentioned the introduction to the slides, you mentioned $337,000 plus was what the value, I guess, of all the projects were. It doesn't seem to add up what you have here, but in all these things, is it just this year that's 337,000?
oh, the 337,000, that's the cost, that was the cost of this study. The
Cost
flood
of study,
study.
for which MVCA paid 58,000, is that? what you're-
3,000, yeah.
I see, okay, and that seems to be a fairly good rate of return, is that because Rito and others shared a large portion of it, or why is our contribution usually is about 50% or so? Why did you, how are you able to negotiate such a good deal?
Well, it's minus 50%, right? So it's just the contribution of the CAs, right? So the federal government provide 50%, so if that would go down to roughly 150,000, right? So it's roughly, you know, 1/3 of the cost of the remaining 50%.
Thank you.
Go ahead, John.
That was a very thorough report, Euro, and forgive me for not being able to absorb more than about 10% of it. It was an engineer's report. And I wonder how my fellow board members can absorb very much of it, but I just have a couple of general questions. We hear a lot about floodplain mapping when there are discussions around adaptations to coming climate change. Are the CAs going to, in Ontario at least, going to be the retainers of this floodplain information, or are we duplicating work that the federal government will do? Like this is valuable information for the future. Are we the keepers of that?
Yes, and we will be also delivering, you know, future floodplain mapping studies that will consider climate change. And I will actually, in my next report, I might be touching on that because we will be considering the climate change and doing some floodplain mapping in addition to our regulatory floodplain mapping event. So the answer is yes.
Could I just have one follow-up question? This may sound ignorant, but why is it so important that we have this information? I mean, in a different world, people would be responsible for building their houses on appropriate areas? Is it because we have a legal requirement to, are we in danger of litigation if we don't tell people where not to build?
Well, I will leave that to Sally to answer. I just want to say that the floodplain, basically hazard mapping, obviously, floodplain, flood mapping and erosion mapping is one of our core responsibility as a conservation authority under the Section 28.
So yes, is the short answer. Conservation authorities, it is under the new regulatory framework, a category 1. It's a core service that we're mandated to provide. It has always been delivered on a as resources allow basis. But I think that what's happened in recent years is people realize the demand for this kind of mapping in the face of climate change and increasing development just generally. People are moving on to marginal lands. All the easy to develop lands are developed, right? So it's two-pronged pressures that we're facing: continued growth and pressures on what used to be considered hazardous lands that nobody wanted to build on, combined with, climate change pressures where what used to be safe to build on perhaps no longer is. And within Ontario, the CAs definitely are the ones looked to identify where the areas of risk and to provide the floodplain mapping. In our jurisdiction, historically, we haven't done a lot of it because it is a costly enterprise. It is not inexpensive to do floodplain mapping. Most of our floodplain mapping has been on the lower Mississippi and in the city of Ottawa, where the city of Ottawa has actually paid, and Euro mentioned it, to accelerate our work in the city of Ottawa. And that's typically what happens across the province is the municipalities that can afford to accelerate the floodplain mapping work in their jurisdictions do so. And there's a strong correlation, as you can imagine, between, urban growth, the assessment value associated with that, and the affordability to do the risk analysis to create the floodplain mapping to allow more growth. So those municipalities that are largely rural, where they don't have these same pressures, there's neither the financial resources nor, quite frankly, the drivers to do the work. So I'll stop there.
I got John on the screen and then I'll come back to you, Phil. Go ahead, John Carreau.
Thanks, Chair. Just a takeaway message for me, and I think it's one that we should all continue to pay attention to, and that is you can't do flood risk management without also looking at climate change. And I think there's an unfortunate tendency on occasion to think that they're two separate initiatives, and that's just not the case whatsoever. It is changing. And if we don't look at those changes, we are at risk of meeting even a core mandate. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Phil?
Yes, just to enlarge on what John has just said, I noticed in recent insurance renewal, even the insurance companies are now asking for information about floodplain mapping. So that might be a reason why it's worth paying for. And I guess the other important thing to carry is, although Ottawa has the resources to do the floodplain mapping, there's generally been a good spirit of trying to support what the Conservation Authority undertakes even outside of Ottawa, and considering Ottawa's paying 90% of that cost, I think they've always been generous, I guess, and fair. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And Janet, and then Richard, then Krista.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow on from John Carreau's, I believe the city of Ottawa is now also asking for a 300-year, what's it called? 300-year flood event, whereas I think legislation is still only 100 years. So the city of Ottawa is taking climate change into account by asking for a 300-year assessment.
Yes, it's 350, just a small correction, but it's.
Thank you.
And we have been mapping the 350 flood lines as part of the second agreement. So we've been doing that for some time, and obviously the next agreement that we are now just about to complete is will also include the 350 floodplain mapping. to kind of address that, that uncertainty that might be related to climate change and how the regulatory flood might change in the future.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, just clarification when it comes to when we start talking about money. I think I heard it was $400,000 a year for 10 years to do this. And I heard another number before that of $3.7 million. Was that to get caught up or what was that?
Yes, that's like the 3.7 was when we sum up all these projects, I
Okay.
rounded it up to 4 million divided by 10, so roughly 400,000 per year. But we need to keep in mind that this is 2022 dollars, right? So we're looking at that 10-year or more planning horizon. So the cost will be obviously larger.
And what's in the budget? Nothing?
Well, in this year's budget, we have included the Clyde and the Carp. Work on
Dollar-wise, though.
the, we can leap over there.
Just
Euro, do you know the budgets off the top of your head?
Well, the Clyde has a budget of 150,000, and then the Carp has the total budget for Carp River floodplain mapping was 200,000. And obviously that's part of, we are receiving 50% support from the city, right? And then I can speak of the next agreement 3 that we are just signing with the city, which has a budget of approximately over $600,000. But that's for the next 5 years to help us with floodplain mapping project. It will be completing with City of Ottawa.
when you're saying we need $400,000 a year, I was just wondering what we have.
So we haven't historically done a lot of floodplain mapping. We've done a lot this term of council, this term that just finished, primarily for the city of Ottawa, but we also did the Lower Miss. So the fact that we're now going upstream within the watershed to do the Clyde is a big step for this organization. The Clyde, if I'm correct, was last done in the 80s.
The Clyde actually remains largely unmapped, Sally. There's only a very few spots that we have some floodplain mapping information going back to the 70s.
So most of the Lower Clyde has no floodplain mapping. The small areas we have, very dated. So this is our first step to start to take a more comprehensive look. Largely to date, it's been focused on the Lower Miss and inside the city of Ottawa. So we're at the very beginning of this process, Councillor Kidd and Reef Kidd. And so it's, we don't have within our long range financial plan, we haven't incorporated this work yet. But the next step in our budgeting process is to update our 10-year capital plan and to look at what this organization might be able to accomplish.
And Sally, maybe if I can add to that, like we have been historically delivering all this floodplain mapping work, obviously as receiving financial support, right, from different programs, right? There's NDNP or the flood hazard mapping and identification program. So that's we will, as I said, we will be receiving portion of the budget that's needed, right, from funding sources.
Thanks. Krista.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. The following, the previous comments really falls well into the comment I wanted to make, which is, tables 1 and 2 reflect 2022 prices. So, if we were to do all of this mapping in 2023, we could probably assume that 3.75, somewhere between there and 4 million would be accurate. And I guess my comment is one for the board moving forward as you're looking at that 10-year capital plan and the long-term financial planning, that you need to be thinking about this in the dollars of those days, because what would be our prices now and what would be the prices in 2030 are going to be quite different. So that was, it's an aggressive plan. I think it says that in the report, but when I'm looking at table 3, I don't think those numbers are probably ones that we can trust too many years out. I just wanted to make that comment as you're doing your planning. Thank you.
Good point. Any other questions or comments? And we're going to move on in the agenda. Thank you, Euro. We have 2 other information reports coming up. Euro, I'm going to ask you to just speed through those. Just give us a verbal skim of those reports rather than going through some slides, just in the interest of time. Because
Yes.
we're halfway through our meeting right now, and we're barely halfway through the agenda.
Yeah, okay, sounds good. So the first one is basically the Clyde River Regulatory Floodplain Mapping Award. So this is a good news story, I guess. You know, as you may know, earlier this year, NRCan launched the new Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program, or FIMP in short, and to support eligible floodplain mapping projects in Canada. The application deadline was this past September, which was perfect timing for us because we just completed this flood risk assessment study and could use the study to support our application, right? And as I showed in my previous presentation, Clyde River was among the top 3 future projects on our list identified in this study. We decided to submit an application for Clyde River floodplain mapping, and I just also want to say the other reason was yes, a lack of previous floodplain mapping for most of Clyde, and the history of severe flooding events in the past, and also which was important for us is that we have 5 water control structures in the Clyde River watershed, right? So we have 2 our own dams, Widow and Lanark, and we also operate 3 dams that MNRF owns, right? So this is Summit, Palmerston, and Canonto. So last month we were informed that our application was successful. The project budget is $150,000, and the federal government will contribute 50%. And this project needs to be completed by March 2024. And this project will be supported by Lanark County. We are already working with the Lanark Engineering Department on some data collection, and also we will be receiving support from MNRF Bancroft District.
Thank you. Any questions or comments on that report? Phil?
Just a quick one. Is this the upper or lower Clyde River? I saw that was in your priority studies. Does the study cover the lower Clyde River or upper?
Yes, this is, thank you for bringing this up, Phil. Yes, this is the lower Clyde River.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
And if I can add, I forgot to mention that we were talking about the climate change and mapping the climate change. So one of the requirements of the new FIMP program is to develop climate change scenarios and map the climate change. So we will be delivering the climate change floodplain mapping as part of this project as well.
Thanks. Richard.
Is it Lanark County that's supporting it or Lanark Highlands?
It's county.
And why would that be?
We've dealt with the county and with the department. So there will be also a support from the village of Lanark.
Any other questions or comments? And we'll move on to item number 6, the land use project report.
So that's another good news story, I guess. This was the second project that we submitted application for under the new FIMP program. And this was submitted in partnership with South Nation, RECA, and the City of Ottawa. And this project will basically update land cover utilizing the latest aerial imagery, and we will also be utilizing the LiDAR data that we recently collected which should significantly improve the accuracy of the data that we will be using for floodplain mapping work. Now, another outcome of this is that this update will provide consistent land cover categories or classes across the 3 CAs and within obviously the City of Ottawa's jurisdiction. And lastly, I think it's worth mentioning that this updated land cover data will have many other applications, right? Like I can name a few, natural heritage mapping, land use change studies, emergency management. We might be looking at, erosion hazards and whatnot. So there's definitely, many more applications of these projects, outcomes than just, like the floodplain mapping. And the total project budget for this update is $222,000. Federal government will contribute 50%, and MECA contribution is $33,000. And this project will be delivered in-house. So the 3 CAs will be basically doing the work.
Thank you, Euro. Any questions on this report? Seeing none, thank you very much, Euro.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Bill 23 update with a presentation from Sally, and we do have a recommended motion, but I'll wait for Sally's report.
So as I think most people would know, Bill 23 was approved by the legislature last week and is now coming into force potentially. Well, certain elements were approved on the day for implementation, largely related to the powers of the minister to execute exemptions. There are elements of the act that or the bill that take effect, have the potential to take effect as early as January 1 that would affect CAs. But all of them are largely subject to the regulation, meaning until the province spells out the details of how some of these things are to be implemented, it's status quo. So this is a key message that we're trying to, in the process of getting out to both our member municipalities, the staff at your municipalities, as well as to the public at large, that until the province comes out with regulations, everything as currently in place is still in place. So the most significant implication of Bill 23, I think, are for your member municipalities. I mean, it was an omnibus bill that had huge impacts on land use planning in Ontario. Yes, there are consequences for conservation authorities. In the scheme of things, I think they pale to what you are experiencing, so I won't dwell on them extensively, just to say that we are there to help you guys as the regulations will allow. And as I hear of what other municipalities are doing, I will absolutely share that with you. If there's an opportunity, for certain models of service delivery that makes sense. I mentioned in the report here that some jurisdictions are looking at potentially getting clearance letters as a, requesting that applicants coming into a municipality as part of their application submission would have to submit a clearance letter that would allow a municipality to kind of bypass having to circulate under an MOU, a CA to review certain factors that maybe you don't have resources in-house to do. Uncertain whether or not even that's going to be legally allowed. There's mixed feelings on that out there right now. I just put it down because it was one of the options that's being considered out there. There are more fantastical kind of options that some municipalities and or CAs are looking at that, quite frankly, none of them resonated with me, and that's why I'm not tabling them here for you. I think the main thing is, though, that everybody understand that we still have to be circulated on certain applications, regardless of what the regulations say, because as part of our Category 1 mandatory services, we actually have delegated authority from the province to look at all risk analysis, right? The potential hazards. So that function will continue as part of our core mandate. And we will follow up with your planning and engineering groups to make sure that there's clarity around both this interim state and then as the regulations come out.
Any questions? Here we have a recommended motion. The recommendation that the board approve submission of a letter to the Minister of Natural Resources and Forestry requesting establishment of a conservation authority working group to support the drafting of regulations under Bill 23 and any further legislative changes. Is this coming through Conservation Ontario? Is this a group effort?
Yes, it is. And sorry, I forgot to mention that. We used to have a working group when we reported into the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks. But since we transitioned under to MNRF just several weeks ago, it hasn't been reinstated. And so we're just advising, we'd like to advise the new minister of our new portfolio that this worked well in the past and we'd like to reinstate it.
Could I have a mover for the recommended motion? Phil Sweetman, seconded by Taylor Poppy. John, I see your hand up. Sorry if I missed it earlier.
That's fine, Chair. I just mentioned earlier on that I wanted to
Yep.
take this opportunity to give a brief verbal report from the Public Advisory Committee on the Mississippi Watershed Plan. And I think it's germane to risks and responses. So in essence, we met on Monday. Sally gave us a good overview as to the implications of Bill 23, both to municipalities and the conservation authorities. And the Public Advisory Committee, I think, really appreciates and understands what those challenges are, but particularly for the watershed plan and its implementation. And I think in that regard, they fully recognize that there's probably going to be an increased need for maybe some alternate delivery mechanisms. And that an advisory committee, particularly due to their working relationships with the municipalities, can also play a very constructive role in that communication and in perhaps in future functions. I think they also recognize that there's an opportunity and a need for other partnerships to look at delivery, and one that I'm very pleased will go forward is a potential partnership with Ottawa Riverkeeper and looking at the question of monitoring. And finally, there was an underlying concern, and it's more at the technical level, but I think it's important to raise, and that is the ongoing concern about the carrying capacity of the Mississippi River for Carleton Place because of the increased development that's taking place there. And I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you, John. Does anyone want to speak to the motion? I'll put the question. All in favor of the motion? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Now we're on to item number 8, which is a budget control report presented by Sally.
You're actually getting me.
I'm getting Stacy.
So year to date to October 31st, we're under slightly both on revenues and expenditures. If we were on target, where it would be about 83%. And as you can see, we're actually only at about 71%. The two keys on that, planning and permit revenues are up, which decreases the pressure on using the operating reserve, which had been budgeted. So we're using less of the reserves. There was also throughout the year, a number of staff vacancies, which on the wages side were about $250,000 under budget for the year. So we're looking at having a surplus this year, which in the next thing I'm going to present on, which is the contribution to reserves and has some motions, that's in there. Are there any questions on the year to date?
I don't see any. I think folks want to get on to the next item.
So as mentioned, this is the 2020 to year-end contribution to reserves. We're typically, the surplus gets transferred to the operating reserve. Where we're at right now with the operating reserve, we have about 500,000 more than what was set in July of this year as the target. So we're actually recommending, instead of moving the operating surplus this year to the operating reserve, that we allocate that to the capital reserve. Because our capital reserve is quite low compared to what the set targets that were set in July are for the various items. There should be, combined with the not using as much of the capital levy this year, we have some excess that we didn't do some projects. There was delays. So I think we were looking at allocating about 400,000. Sorry, I don't have that final number there at the end of the year, assuming we actually continue on trend and hit what our reserves are. So we were proposing the first 150 of the excess get allocated to the building reserve. The next 150 get allocated to water resources, and then there was 50 and 40 to vehicles and equipment and information technology, and any remaining surplus get allocated to the conservation area reserve, maintaining our trails, bridges, et cetera, at the conservation areas.
Thanks, Stacy. We have a motion. I'll put the motion on the floor before we have any discussion. The motion is that the Board of Directors direct staff to, 1, transfer any unspent levied capital dollars as of December 31st, 2022 to capital reserves to meet future capital needs. 2, transfer any operating surplus for the year ending December 31st, 2022 to capital reserves. And 3, transfer any available year-end surplus as follows. The first $150,000 to the building reserve, the next $150,000 to the water resources reserve, the next $50,000 to the vehicles and equipment reserve, the next $40,000 into the information and communication technology reserve, and any remaining surplus into the conservation area reserve. Could I have a mover to put that on the floor? Moved by Paul Kehoe, seconded by Richard Kidd. Any discussion? That was a great report. Maybe you're all going to vote it down, but is there any discussion? No, all in favor of the motion? Motion is carried. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, now we're on to item number 10, which is the draft budget, and Sally will be presenting this one.
How come that's not- Thank you very much. So this report and the draft budget has already gone to Finance and Admin Committee, where we did a fairly comprehensive, almost line by line review. I'm not going to do a line by line review. I'm going to group them by categories of programs and services. But if you have any questions regarding particular lines in the budget, please feel free to ask. So I'm going to start with just generally an overview of the budget process, particularly for those who this is their first meeting at the authority. So it starts back in October when staff received budget direction. And this is primarily focused on what kind of change the board is willing to entertain regarding impacts on the municipal levy. And so it speaks about what kind of assumptions are to be made regarding increases arising from cost of living, increases associated with growth, and any particular assumptions regarding capital because of future capital commitments. So that was done, and we received direction from the board in October. Then, as I mentioned, we did table a draft budget just a couple of weeks ago to Finance and Admin, and they took the first kick at the budget, as they say, and provided some feedback to staff that I'm going to be providing to you here today. So today we're tabling the draft budget, and what happens after today is Once you approve it in principle, assuming it gets approved in principle today, then we go through a formal circulation process where all your municipalities get a copy of the draft budget and have the opportunity to comment on it. This is a regulatory requirement. It is your opportunity at your council tables to consider what the CA is proposing and to provide any feedback to the Conservation Authority before you as a board revisit this next year at our AGM. So over the month of January, I typically follow up with all of the CAOs and clerks at your member municipalities to see if there's any comments forthcoming. And then if needed, we make any further adjustments in a final draft of the budget that will come forward to our Finance and Admin Committee, typically early, like the first week of February. And at that same time, the Finance and Admin Committee has the benefit then of seeing what our 2022 year-end financial statements say. So they're able to look at the 23 budget in the context of having our 22 financial statements. So any final changes are made then, and then it's tabled at our AGM for approval. So that's generally the process that we follow. And as you can see, we're, a fair amount away along the process, but still several steps to go. So looking at the budget in its total, last year's total budget was 5.59 million, and this year it's 5.96 million. So not a huge difference in the total budget. But this is our entire budget and not just the levy portion. So and there's lots of things that are funded by this program aside from our levy. So at a gross level, the increase is roughly 6%. So looking again at a very high level, you can see where the money's being spent. So on the expenditure side, almost 25% is on our capital program. So it's 23% plus something under 1% as a contribution to reserves. And then our primary programs and services are the watershed management, the conservation services, and then the plan review and regulations. And then supporting all of those are the technical studies and watershed planning that are carried out. So the projects that Euro was speaking of are largely, you'll find them in the technical studies side. And then, of course, corporate services that support all of the above. On the revenue side, you can see that the proposed budget has 61% of the funding coming from your member municipalities. And for those of you who are new to the board, I'll just let you know that the allocation of levy charges is based upon a combination assessment population values. And as the largest municipality on an assessment value within our jurisdiction, City of Ottawa pays 90% of that 61% in round numbers. So, and then the balance is shared amongst the other 10 municipalities. So you can see we get, let me move that there. So get that out of the way. So roughly 2% comes from our annual transfer payment from the province. We get, we've been successful or hoping or planning to get a further 3% from a combination of WECI funding from the province. Again, for our new members, WECI is shorthand for water and erosion control infrastructure. So basically think about dams. It does include other things, but think dams whenever we say WECI. DMAF is that disaster mitigation and abatement fund. And that's a federal fund. So those are two primary sources of funding that we have used in the past to do work and are hoping to continue to going forward. And then there are an array of other grants, and Euro mentioned some of those as well. User fees we're assuming will make up roughly 11% of our revenues, and we'll be drawing down on our special reserves by about 16%. And then there's odds and sods of other sources of revenue. But as the budget is tabled before you today, we are not proposing to debt finance any capital works being carried out this year. And I point this out because that was an issue raised at the Finance and Admin Committee, and I'll be touching on this later. So that's the budget, expenditures and revenues at a very high level. So you know where the money's being spent and where the money's coming from. So now I'm going to break that down into the different programs and services areas and highlight what the key areas or initiatives that are being carried out this year or in 2023 that are captured in the budget. So under watershed management, this is 3 tabs of the budget. It's the flood forecasting and warning tab, it's the O&M flood control structures, and it's the preventative maintenance. So these 3 tabs in your budget are all category 1 mandatory programs and services. And so again, for new members, I'm just going to let you know category 1, the province last year approved regulations that have basically categorized the different types of programs and services. Category 1 is mandatory. Category 2 are services that municipalities must deliver on and that they may contract to a CA to deliver on their behalf. And category 3 are recommended activities that staff at the Conservation Authority recommend to the member municipalities that are optional to participate in. So everything under the water management that you're seeing in those 3 tabs of your budget are category 1. And it's 90 to 100% is just your basic payroll and operating expenses to operate, maintain the system. The next category I wanted to touch on are the technical studies and watershed planning. So these are several of the items that Euro spoke to. A couple of additional ones here are we're going to be starting work on the Kashwakamak Lake Dam EA and precursor studies that need to be done. And we're going to be continuing work on the Carleton Place DSR. So we've touched on the CARP and the Clyde floodplain mapping, but a new one that also came down through the new regulations is ice monitoring. This is historically not something that we've done at this Conservation Authority, but it's now a mandatory requirement. And so we're going to be piloting it this year with the goal of developing a formal program in 2024. The regulatory requirement says it has to be in place by December 31st, 2024. So next year is about figuring it out, trialing some things, and then the following year, really putting it into practice. Dam safety review. Thank you. Good question. So then the last piece I wanted to highlight is the land conservation plan and other regulatory requirements. So Regulation 686 of 21 prescribed a whole host of things, and I'm just highlighting the land conservation plan as one, but there's a raft of, I'll call them administrative / asset management type tools and documents that the province is requiring us to prepare. The land conservation plan I'm highlighting in particular is because it's unique in that it extends beyond our conservation areas. What it asks us to do is to look across the entirety of our jurisdiction and consider what land and what circumstances under which we might want to acquire new land for conservation purposes. So this is a study that we just started earlier this year. It's still early days, but you can imagine that this will be of considerable interest to everybody across the watershed. And so as we get preliminary results, I'll be bringing them back to the board and we mapping out an engagement strategy to table this to members of the community. The next one is plan review and regulations. And of course, this is highly subject to change based upon Bill 23. So we're still, trying to figure out with yourselves what the future state looks like. What we do know is that we will still have regulatory requirements to review planning applications that have potential hazard implications associated with them. So, but we're going to have to take a hard look at our mapping, at our implementation guidelines, et cetera. And I think that will be engaging us for a good considerable amount of time in 2023 to make sure we're in compliance and that we're adapting to the new regulatory environment. In the meantime, we haven't made any significant changes to staffing aside to delay the posting of a current vacancy while we're in this wait and see mode. In terms of conservation services, it addresses three tabs in your budget: the property management, the stewardship services and education, and the visitor services. So some things I wanted to highlight to you here is that we had hoped to, but did not get to examining service delivery options for doing CA-based curriculum work with school boards. It was not something we were able to get to this year. Work demands were such that it did not come to the top of the list. It is, however, something that we really need to do in 2023, and we have set aside some funding to do this. The reason being is, as we're engaging with your member municipalities in the coming months about the MOUs and cost apportionment agreements, this would fall under Category 3. So we need to have a plan in place that we can formally table with you that and your councils to discuss what do we think is recommended and doable amongst, within our CA to continue to support education on CA related matters for local school boards and potentially in lieu of them attending the site, but perhaps in addition to them returning to our site. Again, for those of you who are new to the board, we used to deliver classroom training at our sites where kids would be bussed out to our properties and they'd get into the natural environment. A lot of these are from urban areas or suburban school kids. And so their opportunity to be exposed to natural systems and environments is perhaps not as great as those growing up in the rural areas. So we want to look at that and see what we can do continuing going forward. Marissa already spoke to you about the ALICE program, so I won't discuss further on that. There are some major property management initiatives that will be carried out. One is the replacement of the roof at the museum. It sprung some leaks this year, and some work carried out earlier this fall has determined that the whole roof needs to be replaced. We're currently doing a fundraiser in the hopes that we'll be able to offset some of those capital costs with funds raised from the community. We also have a water and sewer connection to build, connecting this building here to that new subdivision. When this building was built, it was known that that property would be developed at some point in time, and monies were set aside to do a future urban connection. But right now we're on well and septic or holding tanks. So we need to, the agreement with the municipality with Carleton Place says when sewer and water is available, we will connect to urban water and sewer. And so that's a project to be carried out this year. Some of this, a smaller project, but still a pretty important one, is reconstruction of a lookout at the Purdon Conservation Authority. And lastly is construction of new toilets at the Milliken Tail. This is viewed very much as an opportunity for us. We saw a tremendous increase in attendance at many of our CAs, and in particular the Milliken Tail during COVID. And those numbers continue to be high, even though we've sort of evolved to a different point in the whole COVID epidemic. So we think new toilets would really help us to service that increased number of people, and to also enable us to better use that site for revenue generation purposes, given the new funding model that we're moving to effective in 2024. So actually, I'm just going to skip that one and head over to the capital program. So we have some potential wrap-up work on the Shabamika Lake Dam that we've set aside some monies for. Jury's still out whether or not we'll actually need to do that, but we've set the money aside just in case. I already mentioned the Kashwakamak Lake Dam, and there's the work at Carleton Place. And those other major projects. The additional one under conservation areas here is Morris Island, doing some bridge repairs. And you can see the dollar value on the sewer connection here, water and sewer here at the headquarters. So now I'm going to talk to you a bit about, that's the highlights of what the budget contains. And invariably there are pressures on the municipal levy. So I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. So the first one you're seeing is a carryover from payroll in 2022. And what this is comprised of is two things. One, in 2019, our funding from the province was halved, and we needed to reduce our FTE count accordingly. But then subsequently, we needed to replace those FTEs because there was still work to be done. And on top of that, we experienced, and many of you experienced, a high degree of growth, and we had to staff up even further. So starting from a deficit position due to the defunding from the province, we had a pressure on our operating reserve of $250,000. So part of our payroll was being paid out of the operating reserve. And the agreement made around this table was we would over time phase that onto the levy, that you cannot continually pay people out of reserves, but that the financial hit of trying to put $250,000 onto the levy in 1 year was too much for anybody in this room to stomach, quite frankly. So it was agreed that we would phase it in over 3 years. And so the amount being proposed in this budget to be phased in 2023 is just over a third, so 97,000. The next piece in this is operating payroll for 2023. So again, as many of you will have experienced in your own jurisdictions, inflation, competition in the workplace has necessitated us to make adjustments to our payroll. And so both in terms of looking at what market rates are, as well as looking at how jobs have evolved over time and making sure people are being compensated fairly. So the board approved what amounted in total across the organization to $125,000 in an increase to payroll to make these adjustments and to remain a competitive or become a competitive employer, depending on the job you're talking about. So in this budget, 2023, we're assuming all of that's going on the operating reserve. We don't put any of it on the levy this year. However, we have identified $92,000 in grants that are helping to offset that. So in fact, only 32.5 is going on the reserve. The next one is new regulatory requirements. So I mentioned that OREG 686 of 21 prescribes any number of studies. And I mentioned specifically the ice monitoring. There are other ones that I mentioned, and the cost of those is $169,000 and change. And we have put 114 of that onto the levy, and the balance we're hoping to have offset by grants. On the capital side, the two main pressures are our baseline annual carrying costs of our loan for this building and for the Shabamika Lake Dam, as well as our PAYGO projects that I've already mentioned. So all those capital projects of a couple of slides ago. So the last pressure to touch on is, of course, inflation, which is affecting all of us. Historic practice at this CA has been to look at the consumer price index for the month of August and to apply that to payroll. This year it was 7, and we knew that that was not palatable. So as we started to draft the budget, we assumed 50% of that, which was 3.5. But literally the day before, I think we were going to be tabling the budget, we heard that it had come down to 3%. Or not tabling the budget, but the parameters for direction from the board. So this budget assumes 3%. And what the table shows you below is samples of the kind of inflation rates that we've been experiencing here based upon typical consumables. So you can see overall pressure increases on our operating capital are, 11 to 13%, but some areas, insurance, and we've all lived that one, is as high as 91% over 3 years, which is huge. So those are the kind of pressures that we're experiencing that are some of the underlying causes for the pressure on the municipal levy. So here's what the budget looks like. That 61%, that part of the pie that I showed you early in the presentation, is what it looks like. So year over year, the difference is, going from 3.375 actually down to 3.6. But with a special levy assigned to the city of Ottawa. But the operating side is where you see the greatest increase, on a percentage basis. And what this looks like is the first line is 3% plus 1.5%. So it's that cost of living assumption plus an allowance for growth. And then you can't sort of see it here, but it's plus that 97,000 I spoke of. I'll just go up a slide or two here. Yeah, right here. That's the additional 97. So that's us trying to push some of this that's being paid out of the operating reserve onto the levy. So again, back down here, this amount is 3% on top of that, 1% on top of that for growth, plus that 97. The capital levy is 4.5% above what it was in 2022, plus another 1.5 for growth. So when you sum these all up, this gross increase here, and you can ignore the city of Ottawa unless you're from the city of Ottawa, but this one here is roughly 7.7% year over year. Now, when we tabled that to the Finance Admin Committee, and this was aligning with what the board had directed us, there was concern. So one of the things I did was, as I mentioned to Jeff up the top of the meeting, is I did go and talk to the city about this, because as our 90% funder, it was important to find out where they're at. So what they clarified with me is they do make a distinction between the tax side and the rate side of their budget. So definitely today, they are going forward with a tax side recommended increase of 2 to 2.5%. And that's where Glengower is, I think, as we speak, probably. But their long range financial plan number 5 is the source document. And this is like their 10-year capital and financial plan. Provides for direction on the rate side. And you can see here that they're much more aggressive increases that they're contemplating. And if I take you down below here to the stormwater portion. So this is combined water, wastewater, stormwater. But on the stormwater side, it's actually a 10 to 13% increase they've approved every single year between 2018 and 2027. And that's because the city itself has recognized that on the stormwater side, it's been the poor cousin and it's been underfunded, and there's an infrastructure deficit. And this is where we are funded. So they have indicated that staff has indicated that they could probably accommodate that 90,000 or so pressure associated with transferring some of that money off of our operating reserve and onto the operating levy. So that said, I didn't have the benefit of that information when I took this to Finance and Admin. So they did direct us to look at how we could reduce pressures. Staff, the management team did go back and look at this. So off the top, we said, well, we could make the some of the capital projects carry some of the cost of staff in that they're dedicated to capital projects. And this is an accepted business practice where you roll in and amortize the cost of staff dedicated to capital projects into the actual cost of the capital project. So that's one thing we could do. We could assume that MVCF might, subsidize some of the costs of doing works that would normally be carried out under the budget of the authority. And that would be, for instance, some of the work at our conservation authorities on those bridges and boardwalks I mentioned. We could make some projects grant dependent, for instance, the washrooms and, the hiring of summer students. And then, as I already mentioned, deferring a junior planner, which is currently vacant by half a year, pending the outcomes of Bill 23. So if we were to implement all of these measures, it would reduce the pressure on the municipal levy this year to 4.77. But it doesn't necessarily address the ongoing pressure and concern we have about paying staff out of operating reserves. So under this revised model then, on the capital side, we could look at additional grants and contributions, what you're seeing under revenues is what we had assumed. The option would be to finance the water and sewer connection here. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that that's a very old cost estimate, and we're not sure what the actual cost will be. It could be quite higher. Our the policies that in developing the reserve policies, some of the discussion that was had around this table was a benchmark against which we would consider financing projects. And if our contribution to a project was greater than $500,000, then we would, the board would consider financing it. So this is, there's a good potential that this, the cost of that water and sewer connection could possibly reach as high as $500,000 all in. So we may want to consider financing it. However, my qualifier, and I'm going to harken back to something that Stacy touched on earlier, is even if we do finance this, her report on the reserve balances shows you that our reserves are very low compared to what our 5-year capital commitments are. And therefore, it would free up, if you went this route and chose to finance this project, we would recommend that we do not change the contribution to the reserves or the capital levy in 2023 from what is proposed in this budget. We recommend any changes be made on the operating side only, because as an organization, we actually over time need to increase our capital levies, not lessen them. So here's how, if we were to implement all those measures, it drops our total pressure down to approximately 4.7 across the board. This, of course, would vary by municipality depending on what your assessment is, but that's what it would look like at a gross level across the organization. So at this point, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sally. We'll take any questions regarding that presentation. Richard, then Bev.
So what was sorry, I missed that at the end. What was the recommendation?
The budget in front of you, and the recommendation is status quo. It's what we tabled to Finance and Admin Committee. The Finance and Admin Committee did not alter that recommendation. They directed staff to look at options for consideration by the board. So I've tabled some options that you could consider.
So those options didn't go back to the Finance Committee?
No.
Okay.
Correct.
So that's why there is no. Okay. And one other question, the holding tank, I guess that's the only cost that we have right now for the way where sewer and water is now.
Yes, so if you're anticipating higher operating costs going forward associated with connecting to water and sewer, that may be the case. We do have costs associated with operating the well and those, the holding tanks, as well as our holding tanks for fire protection. And they cost us a fair amount.
But do we know what that is? Like, I'm just, you're
Uh,
that money's gonna be saved, like,
Yeah, we can do that cost benefit analysis. I would, our contract with the city, or the town of Carleton Place requires us to make this connection. So it's not something actually we have an option around. It has a stated timeline within which we have to make a water and sewer connection once water and sewer is available.
correct me if I'm wrong, just on that. Didn't we build trails in the town of Carleton Place so that we could get this done cheaper at the time? Was that not part of that deal? So when we went to connect, that because we built the trails for them, it was supposed to be a cheaper deal?
So I'll answer, and then I noticed John has his hand up. So we have a relationship with Carleton Place where we go 50-50 on trail development. So it's a $5,000 a year. We provide in kind, they provide cash. And so we'll do the labor and they provide any material supplies that we need to carry out improvements in the Roy Brown Park there. I would defer to others who were on the board at the time to comment on any deals.
John, did you want to chime in on that? John Carew?
Very quickly, I think Richard's point is correct, but to give it a dollar figure is extremely problematic. And Richard, I do recall it was probably on the lower side in terms of any additional savings, but again, memory and old age makes me cautious. My point is different, and I'll come back when the queue allows me.
Sure. Okay, I'll go with Paul and then Phil and then back to you, John.
Thank you.
Okay, so the percentage doesn't really scare me that much. It's actually lower than our percentage that we're looking at for our budget. But I would have appreciated a table that showed what was the impacts to each of the municipalities, because then if we have that information, then that's where the rubber hits the road.
It is on page 37 of the budget. Yeah, so sorry, Paul, was the question regarding the potential revised or the current? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we can produce that and circulate that this afternoon. And you're right, we should have been able to provide that.
Yes, I rather thought that the deal with Carleton Place was one of sort of a mutual recognition. They were the ones that had the nerve to go forward and finance this building for us. And we're not allowed, as some, to actually borrow money. We have to go to and find municipalities who are willing. And it was a big step forward for us and for Carleton Place. And I think they just sold their hydro system at the time. They had a little extra money, so that we got a good rate from Carleton Place. And I think there was perhaps we don't finance trails in many other places, but I thought there was a bit of a quid pro quo in that arrangement, if I might. That's my recollection. Thank you.
John Carew.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Phil, for perhaps a stronger memory lane recapture than I was able to provide. I'd really like to come back to the additional options that you've portrayed today, Sally, and that the Finance Committee had asked for. And I look at your timeline for decision making, and I guess I'm wondering if the options you're presenting really are critical at this juncture, or that they're sort of back pocket considerations if there is additional comment and pushback from municipalities as they look at a draft budget. And I would appreciate your perspective on that context.
So definitely one of the approaches we were taking with this budget, particularly given the uncertainty around Bill 23, was to try to make it a status quo budget, allowing for the fact that if we need to pivot in January, February, there's still that opportunity. And that could be either because our situation changes or because your situations as municipalities changes. So I agree that we could approve, the board could approve the budget as is and keep those as back pocket options. I defer to the members around the table to determine which tactically is the better approach.
Thanks, Sally. Any other? Janet, go ahead.
So just seeking some clarification. I believe what, if you did implement the options, you said the overall increase was 4.7%. But I believe that the rate table that you showed for stormwater was indicating a 4.2% for the city of Ottawa.
Thank you. That's a combined rate. The stormwater was actually 10 to 13%.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll put the record. Oh, Phil, go ahead.
Just the comment that the 374,000 or whatever it is, 370 some $1,000 is, I believe, Carleton Place's estimate of getting the service to our to our thing. There's still the servicing it from within the area, which is going to cost extra. And I would hope that when the time comes, rather than push more levy, that you look at financing it. It's been my submission on a couple of occasions, and even if it came to $450,000, I would hope if the understanding is it should be $500,000, it's not cast in stone, that you consider financing it rather than risking getting the municipalities in an uproar today. When they start paying the cost over time, they may be angry with us for that, but in spite of higher interest rates, it's still money is still pretty cheap relative to inflation. And I wouldn't recommend that we put off connecting. Connected today is going to be cheaper than what it will be at future times. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Janet.
Right. So just to follow on from some of the comments, so I've heard that we may be looking at wanting to approve the budget, but that we want to have enough control in the next year to be able to either finance the sewer and water, leave that as an option, even though it may remain in the budget for now as part of the levy. But we may also want to have some of these options retained as back pocket to pivot on, because there's just so much uncertainty. So I'm wondering whether the motion needs to be amended to be able to accommodate what I think we're hearing in the room, to provide that sort of direction. Thank you.
Can I ask, so Phil has indicated that a preference for financing of the water and sewer regardless. My comment earlier had been that even if we do that, that I recommend the 4.5% plus 1.5% on the capital levy remain. Is there concurrence on that approach, just generally, that we could work into as an amendment now? If there is an interest in the board to make that one particular change at this time? It means that it would make no change whatsoever. But it just reallocates money in terms of coming out of our capital reserve to pay for it. We would finance it. And so it becomes a long-term baseline contribution that we need to make to pay off a loan versus paying it all at once next year. Yeah, it adds to the cost through interest over time. Absolutely. The increase as this budget stands right now is 7.77. That making that amendment doesn't change that.
How does it not change it if we're financing what we were going to pay up front? It must change.
Do you
it.
want to?
What it changes is we're not drawing down the reserves. In order to do the amount of capital projects that are currently in the plan for next year, we're eating significantly into our capital reserves.
So the sewer connection, we were taking it all out of capital reserves. We weren't taking any out of levy. Okay. So that doesn't, to me,
But
that doesn't make much, it doesn't make much difference because the next capital project that you have, if you don't have your capital reserves, you're borrowing the money for that. If you take it out for sewer and water now. So pay me now or pay me later, it doesn't really make any difference.
Yeah. And it's an option if we don't exercise now that can be exercised in future, rather than having to make the amendment to the current budget.
The only thing
Yeah.
the only creative thing I could think of it with that is if Carlton Place would take back, added onto the building, the connection of the sewer and water and finance it that way. So it just becomes part of the bill. That we take the capital cost. And I don't see too big a downside for Carlton Place. It'd just be the capital cost for connecting would be added on to the mortgage basically for the building and then paid out over that time and then you've sort of hidden it.
277,000. 277,000.
It works out to about another year and a half of mortgage payments or the equivalent if you were to spread it out that way. Janet?
Yeah, I think, we think the cost is going to increase. We don't know what the cost of the sewer connection is. So honestly, at this point, I think we should defer the decision until 2023. And we have a different, the other people are on the board and have to make that decision. So I don't think that that's the one that we need to decide on. I think the one we need to decide on is whether we want to include these options that you have indicated that get us from 7.7 down to 4.7 or something, right? I can't remember the numbers, but anyway, that get us down. So whether we include these options now in what you put forward to the municipalities, or whether we defer them until we have more information on the impact of Bill 23 and the regulations, because we're going to need room to move undoubtedly, right? So I can go either way. And I think really we're just looking for some guidance from the rest of the board here on which way we want to go and what form of this budget we want to send to the municipalities.
Deb and then Phil.
Thank you. I think we should send the budget off as is and hold those options back because we just don't know enough. I kind of like the idea of perhaps when a little later, maybe adding the whole connection onto the mortgage. There is a recession coming. There is going to be a huge jump, I think, in our interest rates. So I think we have to be cautious right now. And if I look at it, like it's really Beckwith, Almont, and Carlton Place that have the highest percentage of an increase with this budget. Is it huge? No, but it is an increase, and there's going to be perhaps people around the table, certainly that'll take exception to it. But I just think we do need to hold something in reserve. And the bottom line is, you're not even sure that the reductions that you have put forward, if we're even going to be able to do them. I think we need to wait.
Thanks, Bev. Phil.
I support what you've said, other than I would say, you're saying Beckwith and those have the highest increases. Ottawa is still paying 90% of the load, and we've never griped about that. We'll pay our share and based on an assessment. For the fact that you're paying more means you've had more growth in your area, and we're pleased to hear that for you. So I would support going ahead as it is. I just mentioned to whoever are the next board members, if it gets tight, we're always complaining here, or not complaining, we're always forecasting, gee, we're really short on what we need in capital. And we're saying, take the money out of capital to put in the water and sewer. So it creates the same demand in the future. And I can live with what I think staff have done a remarkable job from their initial idea that they would like to have I think it was for Ottawa, something like 7.9%. And if we get it down to 4.7, I'm sure everyone will be pleased. So I certainly would agree with Janet and Bev, put it forward as proposed. I simply was passing that information on, not as an amendment to the budget, but rather a caution that if you get into problems, you do have the option. And I don't think it's, people are going, as Richard has said, you pay now or you pay it later or over time. Anyway, thank you.
John, I see your hand up on Zoom.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a very quick note that I too am more comfortable deferring on creative financing and dealing with the proposed draft budget. Thank you.
Thank you, John. John Inglis.
Question is, are we going to accept this board of only accept this draft process? Take that draft to municipalities or lots of 6.7% is going to be a point of contention at most municipal council meetings, I would think, because I don't know what we're coming up with in North Frontenac, but I don't think it's going to be 6.7%. I think it'll be lower, and there will be. So what do you do with all that pushback? What's the next step?
So, I mean, that's what the month of January is about, right? And if I haven't presented on the budget to member councils, but every year I offer to do so. So this may be the year where people take me up on that offer. And I am happy to come and present to member councils about the budget and the pressures we're experiencing, and to have the same conversation with them, and to then report back to the Finance and Admin Committee. Management here will take what we hear under advisement and revise the budget as we think appropriate, such that it can get approved by the board at the AGM. So if our sense from, the communities is that the budget as proposed is not palatable, we will start to amend it in accordance with the kind of options we've tabled here for you today.
John?
Yeah, I think the process I would prefer would be to present this budget as it is, and have you defend it rather than myself, because you're far more articulate about details than I could be, and see what happens.
That staff is human shield policy. So the sense I'm getting in the room is there's a consensus to present as is, and then let the chips fall and hold these options as back pocket options should the Finance and Admin Committee need to jump around in January. So with that, I'm gonna Richard.
Yeah, I think I have, like, thinking about this, with Bill 23, with all this is all about perception. Like that's all this is. And if we come, going back to Paul's thing, I'd like to see the dollars, the difference in dollars between the two. And I wonder, are we having lunch and then coming back for source water protection or whatever? I wonder if we get those numbers, because to come out with 7%, we're creating an issue. And then we're going to say we're going to come back and try to solve it if there's an issue. But we're creating perception of an issue is what I'm saying. I don't think it is that big a deal, but with everything else going on and you say 7% and nobody even looks at the dollar figure, you just created an issue and then you're going to bring it back to try to solve it. So why create it? Either present it in dollars and forget about the percentage was what I would, or make that change now and not create the issue. But to create the issue and then try to solve it, the horse is out of the barn. Like it's gone and it's going with everything else. But it all is just perception.
Great, Krista, then. Sally.
I don't want to continue this conversation too much longer than we've already gone. I know we're well over time, but I think this is a really excellent point that Richard's made. There is a perception challenge, and every year when we go through the budget, it's the same thing, and this year it's even more. When we look at that percentage increase, I'm looking on the page 37 here, the attachment 1, impact on municipalities and the levies. I mean, just get rid of that last row in this table, because it ends up creating a conversation that doesn't necessarily need to happen. When you look at the 11 of us, I mean, all of us, with the exception of the city of Ottawa, are under 10,000, most under 3,000 in terms of the variance. And I think that's actually what we need to be focused on, not 11.9 or 7.9 or 7.5 or whatever it might be for the individual municipalities. And not to say that we shouldn't be looking at it and being aware. Of course we should. That's part of us making good decisions, but we're creating a problem by going out this way. And this is my last kick at the can here, but I'm thinking moving forward, get rid of that percentage increase. It's only going to cause problems. It's not allowing for the important parts of the conversations that we need to be having about this budget and the challenges that the CA is having. It's really creating a big eclipse over everything else when we get stuck on the percentage increase. So I'm glad you made that comment, Richard. It's been something I've been thinking about and should have said as well, but we need to enable good conversations on this and enable the good conversations about the work that needs to happen, the good work that is happening, and perception is certainly everything. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
I think that's that's excellent advice. Bev.
I don't disagree entirely with getting rid of it, but I know very well someone's going to say, what's the percentage? And I feel if there's another column that says this is the actual increase, you can argue it then, like, you know, it's because of the growth. Isn't it wonderful? You're having growth in your municipality. Certainly from my perspective with us. So I would caution you at getting rid of it, particularly if Sally, if you come and speak to it. I know very well someone's going to ask about the percentage. And if we don't have it there, but if we can argue it, it's, you know, it's less than $10,000 or whatever. And look at how much Ottawa has to pay. You know, it makes a little bit of a difference.
Yeah, I'd support removing the percentage too, because I just think they might ask the question and the clerk will run through, but the bottom line is I'll be looking at it and saying it's $200, you know, from one to the other, who cares? And then what you do is you get RBCA in our case to send their percentage in. So we'll be so mad at them that won't even notice you, to be quite honest, because they'll charge us 50 or 60 grand. So.
Good. So is that sufficient direction for what goes out without amending our motion to say delete it? I don't want to put delete this column into the motion. Oh, John.
I just want to say I don't agree. It all comes down to how much the individual taxpayer pays, and that is dependent on percent.
It's,
Well, a 6%, a 7% increase to my township is $2,000. 1% of our levy is $65,000. So I have to keep those two numbers in mind. $2,000 is a fair bit of money. I just think you'll be in trouble if you leave out that last column.
Krista, go ahead. Then I'm going to try to wrap things up.
I'll keep this very short then. I understand where you're coming from, John. I certainly do. I mean, all of us have small budgets compared to what the city of Ottawa is. But I think that's the thing we need to keep in mind. Like, if we didn't have the city of Ottawa helping us with the Mississippi Valley side of what we take care of in our watershed, we'd be up the creek, you know, pardon the pun, but we would all be in a difficult position if we had to come up with the funds to do the projects that we need to do. We're infrastructure heavy. And we just spent a lot of time talking about the flood mapping that needs to happen up that side. So we get stuck sometimes on percentages and in increases, and it is our job as politicians to make sure that we're not incurring costs that aren't reasonable. But the thing that I've found over the last 4 years here is we sometimes get stuck in the weeds on these sorts of things. And I don't know if we're really focused on the right parts of the conversation. And not to say that I don't appreciate, you know, the challenges when you get around the table and you know, there's the increases every year with all the things that we do. But I think we need to keep it sort of the bigger picture in mind. And if we were having to do all of these things individually, we'd have an awfully hard time figuring out how to pay for it. And these increases would be exceptionally higher than they are. So I don't know if that might help with the conversations around the table at home, but that's how I try to think about it in Mississippi Mills in any case.
Thank you, Krista. I'm going to put the motion on the floor. The recommended motion that we have is the recommended motion is amended by the Finance Administration Committee is that the board recommend yeah, I've got the FNA motion in front of me. That the board approve the draft 2023 budget for circulation to member municipalities for comment, and that the board directs staff to identify options for cost savings to the municipal operating and capital levies to be presented to the board for future consideration. Can I have a mover, please? John Inglis, seconded by Paul Kehoe. Any discussion on that? All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you, folks.
Good discussion.
Yeah. So where we are with time, we have basically two other items plus adjournment on this agenda, and then we have a source water protection meeting that is, I'm advised, will be very, very short. And then we can proceed on to lunch, which is waiting outside. So we should be able to get work done rather quickly, I'm hoping. The next item on the agenda is item number 14, tab 14 in your binder, or it's item number 14 in the agenda. We pulled from the consent agenda. The reason that this was done is we want to consider an amendment to the meeting schedule, changing the annual general meeting from February the 15th to February the 22nd. This is just coming from a recommendation from the auditor telling us that they need more time to actually present the report to the annual general meeting. So that's something we wanted to consider. If folks are fine with that change, we can make that amendment to the calendar and then adopt the agenda, the meeting agenda for the next year. Janet?
Yeah, sorry to have to raise this, but what does that mean to the city of Ottawa attendees? Because normally this is where we meet on the opposite week from their council meetings.
Yeah, we're already encountering conflicts under this new council, and they haven't set their committees or agendas yet. So we're, I think for that one meeting, we may have some issues. My hope is that we have 5 members appointed by then, and that the majority of the Ottawa appointees will be able to attend. But you're right, it's a potential issue.
Any other comments?
I just want to ask, what happens if we're not able to make it one of these days? Do we get somebody to fill in our spots at the table, or?
If your board or your council wants to appoint somebody to come in your stead, that's fine. There's nothing in our bylaws that prohibit that per se. So if you wish to arrange that with your council, but you do need a council motion identifying somebody as a second.
Okay.
Thank you. So I'll put the motion forward. Is that the Board of Directors approve the proposed 2023 meeting schedule as amended? Moved by Paul Kehoe, seconded by Taylor Poppy. All in favor? That's carried. Next, we have the remainder of the consent agenda. Can I just have a motion that the consent agenda be accepted as presented? Moved by Krista Lowry, seconded by Phil Sweetman. All in favor? Consent agenda is adopted. And next we have a motion. Could I have a motion to adjourn, please? Whoops. The general manager. We just did that. Yeah, we just did that. My blood sugar's low too, Janet. So, yeah, that's what it was. So could I have a motion to adjourn the board meeting, please? Moved by Krista Lowry, seconded by Andrew Tennant. All in favor? Thank you very much, folks. So good discussions. Now we'll move to the source protection meeting. Yeah. I think we can use the same roll call that we did before. I'll call the meeting of the Source Protection Authority to order. The first item is the adoption of the agenda as presented. Could I have a motion to adopt the agenda? Krista Lowry, seconded by Richard Kidd. All in favor of the agenda? Thank you very much. Next, we have, of course, you can always declare any conflict of interest at the time we get to the item agenda item, or you can raise your hand and declare one now if you're aware of it. Then we'll go on to approval of the minutes from the Source Protection Authority meeting of April the 20th, 2022. Can I have a mover to accept the minutes? Moved by Bev Holmes, seconded by Janet Mason. All in favor of adopting the minutes? Minutes are adopted. Next, we have item number 3, which is the Lemieux Island Intake Improvement Project Report. And off you go.
I have to turn the TV down, Ed, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for welcoming me here today. My name is Marika Livingston, and I manage the Source Water Protection Program for the Mississippi Rideau Source Protection Region. I understand there's some new members here, and you'll see myself over the next over a few meetings over the next 4 years. I've just returned from maternity leave with my second child, so I do see some familiar faces. I just wanted to say hello and glad to be back. Before we begin, I'm just going to give a very, very brief overview of the Clean Water Act, particularly for the new members. The Clean Water Act was a new legislation that came out as a result of the Walkerton tragedy in the year of 2000. It protects municipal drinking water sources and gives municipalities the tools and the responsibilities to protect municipal drinking water. The Source Protection Program for our area is jointly administered between the Mississippi Conservation Authority and the Rideau Valley Conservation Authority. And it's governed by a multidisciplinary Source Protection Committee and the 2 Source Protection Authorities. For our region, there are 2 Source Protection Authorities, one for each conservation authority, and the members of the Source Protection Authority are the Board of Directors. We meet about 2 to 3 times annually and whenever agenda items arise. So I invite everyone to turn to page 3 of their agenda package, and I'm going to present the Section 34 amendment that's before you. A Section 34 amendment is part of a formal process as outlined in the Clean Water Act. It's required to update source protection documents. This can include changes such as a new drinking water system, updates to existing policies, or updates to existing drinking water sources. One of the final steps in the amendment process is getting direction from the Source Protection Committee and the Source Protection Authorities, the direction to submit to the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. We are now at this final step for the Lemieux Island Intake Improvement Project. Many of you are familiar with this project since you would have heard from us and my team over the last few years. But for those that are new, I'll just briefly explain the project. Over the last few years in the city of Ottawa, they've had some ongoing issues with fragile ice buildup at the Lemieux Island intake. The city is proposing a new intake deeper and further into the Ottawa River to fix this issue. They're going to retain the existing intake that's in the river as backup should they need that additional flow. This new intake is actually located in the province of Quebec. The amendment does not include any policy changes or changes to the areas where the policies in our source protection planning documents apply. The Quebec Ministry is responsible for the protecting these new zones and bringing them into their appropriate regulations. Recent developments related to this amendment include public consultation, which finished in October. A notice was published in the Ottawa Citizen soliciting feedback from the public or from other stakeholders to give us their feedback on this project. No comments or feedback was received. Therefore, our next steps are to finalize the documents and submit them to the ministry. Before doing so, as mentioned previously, we do need approval from the respective source protection authorities and provide us with direction to submit. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the report.
Thank you, Marika. Does anyone have any questions? No, I'll put the recommended motion on the floor. The motion is that the Mississippi Valley Source Protection Authority approve and direct staff to submit the Section 34 amendment to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Could I have a mover, please?
I so move.
Moved by Helen, seconded by John Carew. All in favor of the motion? Motion is carried. Thank you very much. Did we not approve the minutes? I thought we did. Yeah, we did. Yeah, we got it. Yeah, we approved the minutes. I think it was Bev and Taylor. Oh, it was Janet. Janet was in there. Yeah. So we have item number 4. There's a video that we were going to present. I think we're going to dispense with that in the interest of time.
Maybe we can run it by the reading. I like that idea.
Yeah, we'll do that. There's any other business? No other business that I'm aware of? No, so I'll take a motion to adjourn, please. Paul Kehoe, seconded by Helen again. All in favor of adjournment? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, guys. Merry Christmas, everyone.
Yes, Merry Christmas, everyone online.